there. Galatians chapter 1, I want to begin reading in verse number 15. I'll read about the Apostle Paul. It says, "But when it pleased God, who separated me from my mother's womb and called me by His grace to reveal His Son in me, that I might preach Him among the heathen, immediately I conferred not with flesh and blood. Neither went I up to Jerusalem to them which were apostles before me, but I went into Arabia, and returned again unto Damascus. Then, after 3 years, I went up to Jerusalem to see Peter, and abode with him 15 days. This passage that I've chosen to read to you this morning highlights a less glorious part of the Apostle Paul's life. This morning, my choice is not to speak to you about the time that he was let down the wall, escaping his enemies. As much as I love Acts 17 and Paul's preaching at Mars Hill, can you imagine the philosophy and the opportunity that he had to impart to those people? They were unregenerate. And there he speaks to them about the unknown God. I would have loved to have seen that scene. And when we look at it, it has a majesty to it. It has a power. It's one of the highlights of Paul's ministry. I could even take you to a Philippian jail where Paul and Silas are singing praises. There's a lot of excitement that happens in Paul's life. But this morning I've chosen a passage that highlights one of those less glorious parts of Paul's life, but I believe it was just as important as any other time in his life. When he is basically exiled to Arabia and then eventually back to Damascus for 3 years. The truth is, we don't know a lot about those 3 years. It doesn't tell us what exactly Paul did, but I have no doubt that after Paul's salvation, God set him aside for a period of preparation before he would ever plant churches and turn the world upside down with the gospel. And so this morning I want to speak to you on principles of preparation. Basically, I would say it this way: God had to prepare Paul, and God has to prepare you. I mean, after all, this man wrote 13 or 14 books of the the New Testament, depending on what you do with the book of Hebrews. But you know, before any of that ever could be done, he had to be prepared. There may be some of you right now, you have a little bit of an itch, and you're like, well, Bible college is a waste of time. I need to get out now. Well, let me just tell you, if Paul could write 13 books of the New Testament after spending 3 years in the middle of nowhere, I think you'll be okay for a few years until you go out and turn the world upside down. But I want to ask you this morning, what is your view of your preparation? Last week, as I was listening to my classmates preach, can I tell you, we were all wrecks when we came to Ambassador. If we played some of our earlier messages for you, we'd be ashamed. Right now in my office, I have a VCR cassette of one of my first sermons. I would never show that to anybody. It purely is there as a reminder to me of how horrible my start was. But everybody had to begin there. And the only reason that some of those guys could stand before you and preach the way that they did was because they chose to be faithful in their season of preparation. You know, people always want the finished product, but few want the preparation. And that's true in ministry. Guys who walk across the dorm and walk around the dorm and they talk about how they want to preach with a silver tongue and they can't do their homework. Ladies who talk about the household that one day God's going to give them and how they're going to be a Proverbs 31 person, but yet right now they can't even do a dorm job. I know, I've quit preaching and gone to meddling. But let's be honest about where we're at in our preparation. A lot of people want the finished product, but few want the preparation. You know, the greatest athletes realize the importance of preparation. Back when I was in school, there was a friend of mine, his name was Joel Long. Joel is now a pastor in Williamsport, Pennsylvania. He went to high school with one of the greatest athletes that basketball has ever known, Michael Jordan. Michael Jordan, who was cut during his sophomore year from the varsity team. But the story was told how one day they're in the gym and they're like, "Hey, Michael, come over here, man. Let's go do some 360s. Let's really show off." And he's over there dribbling a ball, and he puts the guys off, and he says, "No," he said, "there's just something not right here in this dribble. I got to smooth it out." They kept bugging him. He said, "Just leave me alone." Here's a man who's working on a fundamental, who's capable of even doing more, but it's during that season, you know what the man understood? He understood this, is that preparation is very important. You know, some of the greatest chefs realize the importance of preparation. I never thought you could watch today on television what you can. They have these, reality shows. I don't watch those, but cooking shows. You know, if you'd ever told me as a kid, one day you're probably going to like watching a cooking show, I'd be like, nah. But, you know, when you like to eat, you sort of like to watch the process, you know. And on occasion, if I have a moment where I just need to relax, sometimes I may watch a show like Iron Chef. It's great because the program's in a foreign language, but they have the interpreters that are giving it to you all along the way, and they're cooking these different types of dishes. But I'm going to tell you what, those guys, they really know their stuff, but I'm going to tell you the finest dishes cannot be rushed, even though they are given time constraints. You know, it's interesting that athletes understand it, chefs understand it, but sometimes we don't. And I want you to think back to the life of the Apostle Paul, and I also want to draw your attention to other Bible examples to show you this morning that, listen to me, treat your time of preparation with the greatest importance. Don't squander it. It's easy to marvel at everything Paul did, but if you forget about the 3 years in Arabia, listen, you might have missed the greatest part of his preparation that enabled him to do it. And so let me give you this morning several principles of preparation. Number one, preparation precedes leadership. Preparation precedes leadership. One of the aims that we have in this school is to train men and women to be leaders in the local church. Men, as pastors and as assistants and as youth pastors, we want you to be godly leaders. For you ladies, when you're fulfilling Titus chapter 2 and you're imparting things to the younger generation, listen to me, that is leadership. I think sometimes we think leadership is totally just designated to men. And while I understand it in the offices of the local church, we need ladies who are willing to disciple and impart things to a younger generation and to lead in their own right. But preparation precedes leadership. You see, you weren't all of a sudden hatched out of an egg and all of a sudden, look, he's a pastor. It's not like your beak just breaks the egg and you go honk and then you're like, I'm a pastor's wife. No, there's preparation that takes place, but sometimes we live that way, and sometimes we despise the preparation. But can I tell you, if you despise your preparation, you'll never make it to the point of leadership. I want you to think back with me several men that encountered this principle that preparation precedes leadership. Moses. Now, I'll tell you, Moses, his preparation was a little bit different than everybody else's. I know that for us, we think, well, if you're going to the ministry, you go to 4 years of Bible college, you graduate, you do this, you do that, and then boom, you're there. Listen, if you just boil that down to an equation, you've got a really shallow view of preparation. Let's talk about Moses for a moment. You want to know how Moses was prepared? Number one, he was raised in Egypt. That's not in the Christian's textbook, is it? It's like, well, if you're going to be prepared for leadership, you have to be raised in the perfect environment, go to the perfect church. Well, how about this? God just shakes it all up and says, you're going to Egypt, pagan Egypt. Now, we know that was God's choice. It wasn't Moses' choice. It was divine providence. But it just goes to show that God's ways are higher than ours. There's some of you that have been raised in solid Christian homes. And you know what? That's part of God's plan, and you ought to thank God for that. Nothing bothers me more than to see somebody who's raised in a good home and they don't realize what they have. But I'm going to tell you, there's some others of you, you were raised in, we would say, less than desirable situations. I was raised in a home where my father drank. I was raised in public school. When I was in high school, I wanted to go to Christian school, but I couldn't. But you know what I find now in hindsight? That was all part of God's preparation. Moses starts out in Egypt, and then before he ever gets in front of Israel, he's on the backside of a desert for 40 years. But all that preparation had to take place before he ever would lead that nation. Joshua's preparation is a little bit different. You look at Joshua's preparation, what happened to him for an extended period of time? He worked under a man, that man being Moses. That was his preparation. And for many of you, you know what's going to happen when you graduate from college? God is going to put you under a good man or a good couple, and that's going to be where you serve. And as well as serving, you're going to be growing and you're going to be prepared. Don't you think when you walk this platform that your preparation stops? And then you have David. David is going to lead the nation of Israel. It's interesting that his occupation beforehand as a boy was a shepherd. Here's a boy who would go out to the fields just probably thinking that he's fulfilling what his dad said. Boy, go watch those sheep. And he's just taking care of his daily responsibilities. And all along, God Almighty knew one day, David, you're going to lead up millions of sheep. And it just goes to show as a reminder to all of us, you take care of the day-to-day things. Listen, when I worked at McDonald's in college, I never thought that managerial experience would ever come in handy to me. Boy, was I fooled. But you know, for me, it was just punching a clock and going into work. I didn't punch in and say, boy, I'll tell you, one day I'm going to be the president of Ambassador Baptist College and I'm going to learn how to run a tight ship. No, I just wiped my eyes at 4 p.m. and took a deep breath and shoved my time card in there and flipped burgers for like 8 hours and closed and went home and went to sleep knowing that I had work to do, but I was too tired to do it. Man, I didn't see the whole picture, but you know, I learned something in taking care of just daily responsibilities. And that's what David did, and one day God elevated him from shepherd to king. You think about the disciples. Here the disciples were specifically called by Jesus, and Jesus would take this group and they would be the leaders of the early church. But had they not had 3 years with Jesus, there would have been no Pentecost. Had they not been 3 years with Jesus, listen, the stories of the New Testament would be gone. And then you think about Paul. Man, Paul sure did a lot, didn't he? I mean, Paul wrote a lot of books in the New Testament. Man, Paul traveled everywhere without the luxury or the curse of American Airlines. Depends on how you look at it, whether they're on time or whether they're late. He traveled in primitive fashions. He got in the worst messes. We read it and we're like, man, what an exciting life. But all the way back in Arabia, you have to learn that preparation precedes leadership. Number 2, preparation takes time. Man, we live in an on-demand society. on-demand entertainment, on-demand service. This is what I want right now. Let me tell you, preparation takes time. For Paul, it took 3 years in Arabia and Damascus. 3 years, that's a chunk of your life. You know, I think about it, in 3 years, a lot can happen. Some of you are going to have 2 children in 3 years' time. Do you know that? You're like, yeah, no, some of you will, especially missionary majors. On deputation or on the field, you may have 2 kids in a span of 3 years. You know, a lot can happen in 3 years. You're like, 3 years? You know, I watch people, listen, I literally watch fellas come in as boys and leave as men in a matter of 3 or 4 years' time. But it takes time to do it. For Moses, it took 40 years. I think most of you are like, well, you know what, I'm on the advanced track. You know, I'm right out of high school, and man, and there are others of you here, you're a little older. And you're like, well, you know, it just took me a while to get to this point. Listen, you don't need to apologize. You going to apologize for God's timetable in your life? Now, I know for some of you, you're like, well, if I'd have gotten saved earlier, or if I would have gotten my head screwed on straight earlier. Listen, why don't you just throw that out the window and just forget it and just go after it? It's not going to do you any good. Sit there and cry over spilt milk. For Moses, it took him 40 years. Moses may not have had, of course, you know, it wasn't like maybe he had 80 years of pastoral ministry, but I'm going to tell you, what he did have was very impactful, and preparation was part of that process. For Moses, it was 40 years in the desert. For Joshua, it was the lifespan of Moses, because there eventually comes a day that Moses is dead and Joshua comes on the scene now as the leader. For David, perhaps a lot of his preparation was in his childhood. He's serving as a shepherd. He's listening to his dad. For the disciples, it's 3 years with Jesus. 3 years is all they get. By the way, guys, can I tell you something? I hope all of you men and all of you women, I'm really burdened about this, because I do not think it happens the way that it should. But I wish that for all of you that, listen, God put somebody in your life that I'm telling you that you can spend some intimate time with and let them shape you and mold you. You know, that originally happened to me very early on in ministry. You heard my pastor that I was saved under preach earlier. Listen, that man, aside from his preaching ministry, he poured into me. He just spent time with me. And he helped me at a very and I don't call him every week. I don't call him every month. But I'm going to tell you, the lessons that I learned, and on the occasions that I do call him, you know, the older you get, maybe that relationship changes. But at this point in your life, boy, it's important to have somebody disciple you. And Jesus had his disciples for 3 years, and that was it. And those 3 years were filled with questions. Those 3 years were sometimes filled with stupid things. You say, that's a pretty harsh word. Well, I know it is, but you know, when all of a sudden they're like, hey, Jesus, who's going to sit on your left hand? Who's going to sit on your right? 2,000 years removed, we're reading that shaking our heads. That was dumb. Why are y'all asking that? Of course, we know the rest of the story, what Jesus is going to say. He has a way of correcting them. But you know what? In discipleship, sometimes it just takes, sometimes you saying stupid stuff to the person that's trying to shape you. Why can't I do that? Just listen to me and I'll tell you why you can't do that. But it's that kind of interaction. Jesus had 3 years with his disciples. Paul, he had 3 years in Arabia. Let me ask you, at this point in your life, how do you size up your time of preparation? Reflect on your childhood a little bit. Reflect on how you got here. and reflect on what you're doing right now. And remember this, preparation takes time. Number 3, the extent of your preparation will determine the extent of your usefulness. The extent of your preparation will determine the extent of your usefulness. What am I saying here? I'm saying if you're slipshod in your preparation, then you'll be slipshod in your ministry. That's what I'm saying. I think if I asked this question today, I said, how many of you want to have the fullest ministry possible? Everybody would raise their hand, if for no other reason, peer pressure. Because that's like the correct answer. But I would say to you, if you want full ministry, then you ought to desire full preparation. I want you to think with me about Paul for a second. Let's think about his upbringing. Paul was raised as one of the most educated Jews and most devout Jews you could find. Okay? And this man, I'm telling you, you read Philippians, and he says, I count all of this but dung. But he was a Hebrew of the Hebrews. He sat at the feet of the greatest teachers. He was so zealous that he persecuted Christians. And it is this very same man that writes the greatest theological works we've ever seen. Romans. Man, you start out in Romans chapter 1. He's talking about the depravity of man. He continues through the book and he talks about the sanctification process. He very clearly articulates salvation. By the end of the book of Romans, he's talking about practical things. How does a man write a book like that? How can a man be taken from Jesus denier to Jesus proclaimer? Well, first of all, it's salvation, but number 2, preparation. I think in those 3 years in Arabia, I think he had to sort through a lot of what he'd been taught and say, all right, I got to look back at this now in this Old Testament through some different eyes. I'd been cussing Jesus all this time, and this book I've devoted my life to studying. Well, it actually tells me more about Him. And you know what? It takes time to reflect. It takes time for you to go through that. But had Paul not spent that time, I don't know that any of these other books would have been written. Right now, listen, how thorough do you want to be in your preparation? I think, one thing I think I'm going to do next semester is I'm going to get somebody to come in and do a Logos seminar to meet you guys where you're at with it. And then I want somebody to come in and do that with music notation software too. You know why? Because I'd like to think when you get out of here, you're going to study messages the rest of your life. You're going to study passages the rest of your life and preach. For you guys that are in music, I'd like to think you're going to arrange. I would like to think that you're going to do things in a church and it's going to require work, and every tool you have, you need. People shortcut tools. They're like, well, you know what, I don't want to shell out the money for this. Well, that's funny. The same people that don't want to shell out money for music notation software and Bible software are the same ones that will shell it out for an iPhone. One's going to help your communication. The other one's going to help you minister the rest of your life. Why shortcut yourself? So often we're focused on the wrong things, aren't we? The extent of your preparation will determine the extent of your usefulness. Listen, you right now, if you shortcut yourself, it's going to hurt you. And that leads me to number 4. A shortcut in preparation will cause you to shortchange those in your future ministry. A shortcut in preparation will cause you to shortchange those in your future ministry. You know, when I came to college, I hated Greek. And Greek 1, I just got through it just to get through it. But I'm going to tell you, when I got to second year, I realized, boy, did I make a mistake. Because you know what knothead had to do? Knothead referring to me. First 8 weeks, I had to go back and study everything that I just went about the first year. And caused myself grief in my preparation. Shortcuts. You know, a shortcut feels easy now, but I'm going to tell you, it'll weigh on you heavily later. Listen, you've got to take the time to prepare. You can't just, it's just not add water and mix. A few months ago, I went by, we have a meat vendor here in town. The title of the place is called Latamoo, is what it's called. They sell, you know, just natural beef. And I went in there one day and I picked up a small brisket. I didn't want a huge one, I wanted a smaller one. I thought, you know, one day I'll cook this thing up for a lunch or a dinner. And my son Andrew, he's a sheriff's deputy. Sometimes he'll come by the house before he goes into work at 6 o'clock in the evening, and it's usually to look in the refrigerator and see what we've got. And I thought, you know what? I'm going to do something special for him today. I'm going to cook this brisket. And it was one of those days that, I got hammered. And I got home and I thought, you know what? I'm just going to rush this thing along. And so I did. I rushed it along. And you know what? I even got it up to 175 degrees. I thought, you know what? Internal temperature, nobody's going to die of food poisoning. Man, I'm sorry I had to rush this, but, you know, at least it was. Well, Andrew came in and he didn't have time to stay, and so I cut it up. And when I cut it up, I said, oh, this is bad. And so I did. I put it in a container for him. We talked for a minute. He left, and I'll never forget the next day. And the next day when I saw him, I said, son, I said, I'm so sorry. And he started laughing. He said, Dad, he said, when I started trying to chew it, he said, I just chewed it forever. He said it tasted great, but he said I couldn't eat it. And I told him, I said, oh, son, I know, trust me, I tried to eat it after you left, and it was horrible. Let me tell you the key. The key is low and slow, and when you're done, you want that brisket to be like 200, 201 degrees, so it has just melted all of that fatty stuff that's in there where it's just delicious. But you didn't come here for a cooking lesson, but I'm going to tell you, there's something worse than eating brisket that's been ill prepared, and that's when you go out and you minister and you're ill prepared by your own choice. You take a shortcut now, but it'll cost you later on. Number 5, the time of preparation is rarely glorious. The time of preparation is rarely glorious. You know, there are times in league sports you might enjoy a game-winning shot, like I just heard last week happen. Ladies, you might enjoy a game-winning spike or a kill or whatever you call those things. And you're like, boy, that was great. You know, those are little glorious moments in the Bible college environment. But I'm going to tell you, a lot of it's just daily grit. 1 John, comp paper, research paper, project. You know, it's rarely glorious, but can I tell you, when guys go into the Navy SEALs, their preparation's definitely not glorious. We had one of our graduates who ended up being a Navy SEAL, and he's telling me about the process. There was nothing that appealed to me at all about that process. Pain, hardship, crying, soreness, uncomfortableness. It just didn't appeal to me at all. But you know what? He made it. But he had to be willing to go through the preparation. Listen, preparation is rarely glorious. But let me tell you this last thing. Preparation never ends. It doesn't stop after Bible college. Because you see, God's always preparing you for the next chapter in your life. Boy, after Paul gets out of Arabia, I'm going to tell you what, he goes to Jerusalem, meets with the church leaders, and then it's on. And I'm going to tell you what, it's chapter after chapter until he winds up in the prison and he's beheaded. But there's a sequential preparation that takes place in your life. You ought to always be a student. You ought to always be teachable. And here's the reality. You know, our time on earth is preparing us for our time in heaven. I read in the Bible and I see everything that's going on in eternity, but I'm going to tell you, I'm sure there's a lot of things that are going to go on that I'm not all too up on. I'll have to look and research and study and still I can't comprehend everything that's going to happen in eternity. But I'm convinced that, listen, this period of life in which we're living in sanctification, it's preparing us for glorification. It's preparing us for eternity. Preparation never ends. So as I end the message today, I want to ask you a few questions this morning. How are you doing in your academic preparation? That's measured by more than a GPA. Listen, you can have a 4.0 and have a cold heart. But I will admit, if you have the GPA of a corpse, something's wrong. But how are you doing academically? In general, are you stepping up to the plate, or are you just lazy? It's all part of your preparation. Do you do your best? You know, there's some people you do your best in here, and that's a B. Some people do your best on an assignment, and you get a C on it, and you're just like, did you do your best? I did. All right, well, then that's good. That brings glory to God. A C can bring glory to God if you do your best. A B can bring glory to God if you do your best. But how are you doing academic? That's part of your preparation. If you're not going to study for a class, what's going to make you think you're going to study for a message? Ladies, if you're not going to study for a class, what makes you think you're going to be able to speak and pour your time into a ladies' devotional or ladies' meetings where ladies get together and preach to each other? You know what I'm talking about? Let me ask you this. How are you doing in your emotional preparation? You know, one of the ways you're developing right now is emotionally and socially. There was a student we had several years ago. My goal was I obviously wanted to be spiritually prepared, but I said to myself, dear God, help us to get this guy emotionally and socially prepared. That was my goal. While some students were making fun of him, I said, they can do that if they want, but instead of hurting him, I'm going to help him. And you do well to take on that same mentality. You know, there's some people, I'm telling you, emotionally, they're just grossly immature. You come and you're just like, man, I'll tell you, the slightest thing devastates you. Well, you know why you're here? Because God's trying to bring you along. Listen, you're not perfect. None of us are. But how are you doing emotionally? Are you just as much on a roller coaster your senior year as your freshman year? If that's the case, listen to me, that's not God's fault. You've got to get out of the way and let Him work. And what about your spiritual preparation? Are you deeper now than when you started? Have you learned some things that mean more to you today than when you came? You need that spiritual preparation. Listen, guys, right now, you're in a season of preparation. You've got a choice to make. You want to know what that choice is? You can either curse it or you can enjoy it. And I'll tell you what, if you enjoy it instead of cursing it, just like Paul had books of the New Testament ahead of him and churches to be planted, there'll be a lot that'll be ahead for you, but you've got to treat your time of preparation seriously now. Paul had 3 years in Arabia. Surely if Paul had to take 3 years in Arabia, you can take a few years in your life right now, treat it with the greatest sincerity, and go forward and be used of God. I hope that you'll remember these principles of preparation. Let's bow together in prayer. Our Father, as we close this service today, I pray that you'll help us all to have a little perspective of what you're doing. Lord, I pray that you'll help each of us to be serious about this time of preparation. And Lord, I'm keenly aware that even at my point in life, you continue to prepare me for the future. Lord, may you help us to be patient. May you help us to be diligent. Instead of cursing our time of preparation, help us to see your hand in it.